You wake up at 3 in the morning with that suffocating sensation in your chest, a mix of exhaustion and restlessness that hasn't let you sleep properly for weeks. You stare at the ceiling in the dark, and your mind immediately starts racing through everything you need to do, everything you're building, everything you're becoming. Your body screams for rest, but something deeper inside you won't let you stop. You're exhausted, but it's not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. It's something else entirely, something that makes you wonder if maybe you're doing too much, pushing too hard, burning out before you even reach whatever it is you're chasing. You've been working on yourself, growing, evolving, reading the books, listening to the podcasts, doing the therapy, building the business, improving the relationships, and yet somehow you feel more drained than you did when you were doing nothing at all. There's this gnawing feeling that growth shouldn't feel this heavy, this overwhelming, this much like you're drowning while everyone else seems to be swimming just fine. You look around at people who seem content with their routines, their predictable lives, their simple pleasures, and part of you envies them because at least they can sleep at night without this constant pressure to become more, do more, be more. The worst part is you can't even explain it to anyone without sounding ungrateful or dramatic because on paper, your life looks like it's going exactly where you wanted it to go, but inside you feel like you're being pulled apart by invisible hands that won't let you rest until you've reached some finish line that keeps moving further away every time you get close. What if I told you that this feeling, this exhausting, confusing, sometimes unbearable sensation of growth that feels like burnout, isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong? What if this is actually evidence that you're doing something profoundly right, something most people never dare to attempt? What if the pain you're feeling right now is not breakdown, but breakthrough, not collapse, but transformation, not burnout, but the forgotten stage of growth that Abraham Maslow discovered in his research, but that somehow got lost in all the pretty pyramid diagrams we see plastered everywhere? The problem is that we've been sold a sanitized version of self-actualization, a glossy Instagram-filtered idea of personal growth that makes it look like some peaceful upward journey, where you meditate your way to enlightenment while sipping green smoothies and everything just flows. Nobody told you that the space between where you are and where you're becoming is messy, chaotic, exhausting, and sometimes feels exactly like burnout, even though it's the opposite. Nobody warned you that when you start climbing from one level of needs to another, when you begin to outgrow the version of yourself that felt safe and familiar, your entire system goes into alarm mode because growth, real growth, feels like threat to the part of you that just wants to survive. This is the stage Maslow called the transition between esteem needs and self-actualization, the forgotten phase where you're no longer satisfied with external validation, but you haven't yet found that internal sense of purpose that makes everything make sense. And it's in this gap, this uncomfortable in-between space, that most people turn back because it feels too much like something's breaking inside them. The most transformative discovery Maslow made wasn't about happiness or success or achieving your dreams. It was about why people who have everything they thought they wanted still wake up feeling empty, and why the journey toward meaning and purpose feels more like crisis than celebration, especially in the beginning. Today I'm going to show you exactly why growth sometimes feels like burnout, what's actually happening in your psychology during these transitions, and why understanding this forgotten stage might be the key to not giving up right before your breakthrough. In the early 1950s, Abraham Maslow began studying a particular type of person who showed up in his private practice and research interviews, individuals who had achieved conventional success, but were experiencing what they could only describe as a kind of existential exhaustion. One case stood out in his notes: a 42-year-old executive from Manhattan who had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder with impressive results. This man, let's call him Richard, had the corner office, the salary that most people dream about, the respect of his colleagues, the beautiful family, the house in the suburbs, everything that should have made him feel accomplished. Richard came to Maslow, not because he was depressed in the clinical sense, not because his life was falling apart, but because he was experiencing a paradoxical combination of intense drive and complete depletion. He would wake up every morning with this compulsion to keep building, keep achieving, keep moving forward, but simultaneously felt like he was running on empty, like his tank had been drained and he was operating on fumes. What fascinated Maslow about Richard's case was that this wasn't burnout from overwork in the traditional sense. Richard had actually started delegating more, working slightly fewer hours, taking better care of his health. The exhaustion was coming from somewhere else entirely, from a psychological shift that was happening beneath the surface of his conscious awareness. As Maslow dug deeper through months of conversations, he began to see a pattern. Richard had spent his entire adult life building his identity around achievement, around being respected, around earning his place at the table, and he had succeeded at that game completely. He had satisfied what Maslow would later categorize as esteem needs, the need for recognition, status, accomplishment, respect from others. But something had shifted in Richard's internal world. The validation that used to fuel him, the promotions, the praise, the external markers of success, had started to feel hollow, empty, almost meaningless. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate them anymore. It was that they weren't feeding whatever hunger had awakened inside him. Richard described it to Maslow as feeling like he was wearing a costume that fit perfectly but somehow wasn't his anymore, like he was playing a role that everyone applauded, but that felt increasingly alien to who he actually was. The exhaustion Richard felt was the energy it took to keep performing this identity, while a deeper part of him was trying to emerge, trying to pull him towards something he couldn't yet name or understand. Maslow recognized this as the transition point between the fourth level of the hierarchy, esteem needs, and the fifth level, self-actualization, the need to become who you actually are, rather than who you've been conditioned to be. What made this discovery revolutionary was that Maslow realized growth between these levels doesn't feel like progress, it feels like crisis. When you're moving from basic needs like safety or belonging up to esteem, the path is relatively clear because society gives you a roadmap. Get the job, build the relationships, earn the respect, achieve the goals. But when you start moving from esteem into self-actualization, there's no external roadmap anymore. You're leaving behind the metrics and validations that used to tell you if you were succeeding. And you're entering territory where the only compass is internal, where you have to figure out what actually matters to you beyond what you've been taught to want. This transition is terrifying because it requires you to question everything you built your life around, to dismantle the identity you worked so hard to construct, to risk disappointing people who loved and respected the old version of you. The reason it feels like burnout is because you're essentially running two operating systems at once. Part of you is still trying to meet those esteem needs, still seeking validation and achievement and external proof of worth, while another part of you has awakened to something deeper and is pulling you toward purpose, meaning authenticity, contribution beyond yourself. These two drives are in conflict, and the friction between them creates that exhausting sensation of being pulled apart, of working incredibly hard but feeling like you're getting nowhere, of being successful but empty, of growing but feeling like you're breaking. Maslow documented this pattern across dozens of individuals over years of research. He found that people in this transition phase often experienced what he called growth anxiety, a specific type of psychological tension that comes not from threat or trauma, but from the discomfort of expanding beyond your current identity. Growth anxiety manifests as restlessness, insomnia, irritability, a sense of urgency mixed with confusion, difficulty concentrating on things that used to matter, and that peculiar exhaustion that rest doesn't fix because it's not physical tiredness. It's the mental and emotional energy required to hold space for two conflicting versions of yourself simultaneously. What fascinated Maslow even more was that people who pushed through this phase, who didn't interpret these symptoms as burnout and quit, who understood this was transition rather than breakdown, often emerged into what he described as peak experiences and self-actualization, a state where life suddenly had clarity and purpose and energy returned, but from a different source, not from external validation, but from alignment with their authentic self and contribution to something larger than their own success. Richard's journey through this transition took nearly 3 years. There were moments when he seriously considered that maybe he was just ungrateful. Maybe he should be satisfied with what he had accomplished. Maybe this searching was just midlife crisis nonsense and he should get over it. But Maslow encouraged him to trust the discomfort, to see it not as pathology, but as evidence that he was outgrowing a stage of development that no longer served him. Richard began experimenting with small acts of authenticity, moments where he made choices based on what felt meaningful, rather than what would impress others. He started a mentorship program at his company, not because it would boost his resume, but because he genuinely wanted to help younger professionals avoid the empty success trap he had fallen into. He began saying no to opportunities that looked impressive on paper, but felt hollow to him personally. He started having more honest conversations with his family about his values and what actually mattered to him beyond career achievement. These shifts were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually Richard noticed that the exhaustion began to transform into something else. It wasn't that life became easier or less demanding. It was that the energy he was expending started to feel aligned rather than fragmented. He was no longer burning fuel to maintain an identity that wasn't truly his. He was channeling energy toward becoming who he actually was. And that made all the difference. The pattern Maslow identified in Richard showed up consistently across his research subjects. The transition from esteem to self-actualization is characterized by several recognizable stages. Level 1 of this transition is what Maslow called the awakening, the moment when external validation stops satisfying you the way it used to, when achievements feel hollow, when you start asking deeper questions about meaning and purpose. This stage often feels like mild depression or disillusionment, because you can't understand why success doesn't feel like you thought it would. Level 2 is the confusion phase, where you're caught between the old identity and the emerging self, where you're trying to please others while also honoring this new internal voice, where you're achieving externally while dying internally. And this is the phase that most closely resembles burnout, because you're expending enormous energy to maintain two incompatible ways of being. Level 3 is what Maslow called the letting go, the gradual or sometimes sudden release of the need for external validation, the willingness to disappoint others, to risk your reputation, to choose authenticity over approval. And this stage is terrifying because it feels like you're destroying everything you built, even though you're actually just shedding what was never truly yours. Level 4 is the emergence, where you start to discover what self-actualization actually means for you specifically, what your unique contribution might be, what brings you alive beyond ego gratification, and this is where energy starts to return, but from a different source, not from proving yourself, but from expressing yourself. Level 5 is integration, where your life begins to reorganize around your authentic values and purpose, where decisions become clearer because you have an internal compass rather than seeking external approval, where you can still appreciate recognition, but you're no longer dependent on it for your sense of self-worth. What Maslow emphasized repeatedly in his writing is that this transition cannot be rushed and cannot be skipped. You cannot go directly from seeking esteem to living in self-actualization without passing through this uncomfortable in-between stage. The reason so many people abandon the journey is because they interpret the discomfort as a sign they're going in the wrong direction, when in fact it's evidence they're going in the right direction, but the terrain has changed and requires different navigation skills. The exhaustion you feel during this phase is not burnout from doing too much. It's the energy cost of transformation, of shedding an old skin, of rewiring your entire motivational system from external to internal, from approval-seeking to purpose-driven. Maslow found that people who understood this distinction, who could name what was happening to them and recognize it as growth rather than breakdown, were far more likely to persist through the difficulty and reach the other side. One of the most powerful examples Maslow studied was a woman named Eleanor, a successful attorney in her late 30s, who came to him experiencing what she described as complete burnout, despite recently making partner at her firm. Eleanor had worked brutally hard for over a decade to reach this position, had sacrificed relationships, health, hobbies, everything in service of this goal, and when she finally achieved it, she felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, not relief, just a profound emptiness and an exhaustion so deep she could barely get out of bed on weekends. Eleanor's case was particularly striking because she wasn't just tired from overwork. She was tired of the person she had become in pursuit of success, tired of the values she had adopted without questioning them, tired of performing a version of femininity and professionalism that had never actually fit her, but that seemed necessary to succeed in her field. What looked like burnout on the surface was actually her authentic self, trying desperately to emerge from beneath layers of conditioning and performance and survival strategies that were no longer serving her. Maslow worked with Eleanor over 2 years, helping her understand that she wasn't broken, she was transitioning. The emptiness she felt after making partner wasn't failure. It was the natural result of achieving a goal that was never truly aligned with her deeper self, a goal she had pursued because it seemed like what success should look like, rather than because it fed her soul. The exhaustion wasn't from doing too much. It was from doing things that required her to betray her authentic nature, to suppress parts of herself that didn't fit the corporate attorney mold, to prioritize achievement over meaning. Eleanor's breakthrough came when she started asking a different question. Instead of asking, how do I recover from burnout and get back to performing at the level I'm supposed to, she started asking, who am I beneath all these achievements, and what would I do with my life if I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone? This shift in questioning opened up entirely new possibilities. Eleanor began exploring aspects of herself she had buried for years: her love of writing, her passion for social justice beyond billable hours, her desire to mentor young women who were facing the same pressure to perform that had nearly destroyed her. Look, I know how lonely and confusing this place can feel, that space between who you've been and who you're becoming. You're lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering if maybe you're just broken, if maybe everyone else figured out how to be satisfied with success and you're the only one who can't seem to make it work. If maybe this restlessness and exhaustion mean you should just give up and go back to the predictable path that at least didn't hurt this much. Have you been there in that dark space where growth feels so much like burnout that you can't tell the difference anymore? Where pushing forward feels just as impossible as staying where you are? I know how that feels, that sensation of being caught between two worlds, not quite fitting in the old one anymore but not yet arrived in the new one either. Feeling like you're disappointing everyone, including yourself, just by asking these questions. If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment. I am in the in-between. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone. You have more power to heal than you imagine. The transition Eleanor went through illustrates something crucial that Maslow discovered about the nature of self-actualization. It's not a destination, it's a direction. Self-actualization doesn't mean you reach some enlightened state where everything is perfect and easy, and you never struggle again. It means you've shifted your primary motivation from seeking external validation to expressing your authentic self and contributing your unique gifts to the world, regardless of whether that brings recognition or approval. The people Maslow identified as self-actualizing, figures like Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Abraham Lincoln, Jane Addams, weren't people who had transcended all problems or achieved some perfect life. They were people who had found purpose beyond ego, who were driven by values and contribution rather than approval and status, who had made peace with disappointing others in service of their authentic path. What distinguished them wasn't the absence of struggle but the presence of alignment, the sense that their energy was flowing in a direction that mattered deeply to them, regardless of external outcomes. Maslow identified several common characteristics among people who had successfully made this transition, from esteem needs to self-actualization. First, they developed what he called problem-centered rather than ego-centered orientation, meaning they became focused on work and causes that mattered beyond their personal success, focused on contribution rather than accumulation. Second, they cultivated a high degree of autonomy and independence from social pressure, not in an arrogant or isolated way, but in the sense that their internal values guided their decisions more than others' opinions. Third, they experienced regular peak experiences, moments of profound meaning, connection, transcendence, flow, where they felt aligned with something larger than themselves. Fourth, they maintained what Maslow called freshness of appreciation, the ability to experience wonder and gratitude for ordinary things, to see life with less cynicism and more presence. Fifth, they formed deeper but fewer relationships, prioritizing authentic connection over superficial networking, quality over quantity in their social lives. Sixth, They developed a strong ethical sense that wasn't based on religious dogma or social conformity, but on deeply considered personal values. Seventh, they maintained a healthy sense of humor that was philosophical rather than hostile, able to laugh at human nature and their own quirks without mockery. What's critical to understand about these characteristics is that they don't magically appear. They develop through the painful transition process we've been discussing. Eleanor didn't wake up one day suddenly autonomous and purpose-driven. She went through years of discomfort as she slowly disentangled her self-worth from external validation, as she learned to trust her internal compass more than others' approval, as she built the courage to disappoint people who expected her to stay in the role she had outgrown. Richard didn't instantly shift from achievement-focused to contribution-focused. He spent years experimenting with small acts of authenticity, gradually building the muscle to make choices based on meaning rather than status. The exhaustion they felt during this process wasn't burnout that needed to be fixed. It was growth pain that needed to be honored, understood, and trusted. Maslow also documented the phenomenon of regression during this transition, the tendency to fall back into esteem-seeking behaviors when the discomfort of growth becomes too intense or when external circumstances create instability. He found that even people who had begun the journey towards self-actualization would sometimes retreat to familiar patterns of seeking validation and achievement when facing crisis, loss, or overwhelming stress. This regression isn't failure, it's part of the natural rhythm of growth. You take steps forward into authenticity, then something happens that triggers your survival instincts and you step back into performance and approval seeking because it feels safer. Then eventually you gather courage and step forward again. Maslow emphasized that growth is not linear, it's spiral, circling through the same lessons at deeper levels, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, gradually expanding your capacity to tolerate the discomfort of becoming who you actually are. One case that illustrated this regression pattern beautifully was a man named Thomas, a musician who had achieved moderate success in his 30s, playing other people's compositions and arrangements that fit market expectations. Thomas came to Maslow during a period where he felt completely burned out on music, despite it being his supposed passion. Through their work together, Thomas began to recognize that his exhaustion wasn't from music itself, but from constantly suppressing his own musical voice in favor of what would get him gigs and approval. He started experimenting with composing his own pieces, playing styles that felt authentic to him, even though they didn't fit neatly into commercial categories. For a period of about 6 months, Thomas experienced a renewed sense of energy and purpose, the kind of aliveness that comes from expressing rather than performing. But then he suffered a financial setback, lost a major contract, and panic set in about how he would pay his bills. Almost immediately, Thomas regressed back into seeking whatever commercial work he could get, abandoning his authentic compositions, falling back into the exhausting pattern of playing what others wanted rather than what he needed to express. He felt ashamed of this regression, like he had failed some test of authenticity. Maslow helped Thomas understand that this wasn't failure. It was the natural response of a nervous system that still associated survival with external validation. When Thomas felt financially threatened, his hierarchy of needs automatically reorganized. Safety needs came flooding back to the forefront, and his emerging self-actualization needs temporarily took a back seat. This is completely normal and doesn't mean you've lost your progress. Maslow emphasized that the journey towards self-actualization requires a foundation of relative stability in your lower needs. If your safety or belonging feels genuinely threatened, your psychology will naturally prioritize securing those needs before you can return to self-actualization work. The key is recognizing this as temporary regression rather than permanent failure, trusting that once you restabilize your foundation, you can return to the growth edge where you left off. Thomas did exactly that. He took commercial work to stabilize his finances, but this time he did it consciously, knowing it was a strategic retreat rather than abandoning his authentic path. Within a year, he had rebuilt his financial foundation and returned to his compositional work, this time with more patience and less judgment about the inevitable ups and downs of the journey. The pattern Maslow observed across all his case studies was that the transition from esteem to self-actualization requires 3 essential elements. First, Awareness that what you're experiencing is growth rather than burnout, that the exhaustion and confusion are symptoms of identity transition rather than signs you're doing something wrong. Second, patience with the nonlinear nature of the process, understanding that regression is part of growth, that you'll move forward and forward again, and that this is how transformation actually works rather than some straight line toward enlightenment. Third, support from at least one person who understands this journey, whether that's a therapist, mentor, friend, or community, someone who can reflect back to you that you're not crazy or broken, but courageously becoming who you actually are. Without these three elements, most people interpret the discomfort as pathology and either regress permanently to the safer territory of esteem-seeking or push through with sheer willpower in a way that actually does lead to burnout because they're fighting the process rather than flowing with it. Maslow's work also revealed an uncomfortable truth about self-actualization that rarely gets discussed in popular psychology. The journey toward authenticity and purpose often requires you to become temporarily less successful by conventional standards. When you stop optimizing for external validation and start aligning with internal values, you might make choices that other people find confusing, disappointing, or even irresponsible. You might leave the prestigious job for work that pays less, but matters more. You might end relationships that looked perfect on the surface but felt hollow underneath. You might pursue projects and passions that don't have clear career trajectories or social status attached to them. From the outside, it can look like you're throwing away everything you worked for, like you're having a breakdown or crisis. From the inside, it feels like finally waking up, like shedding weight you didn't realize you were carrying, like coming home to yourself after years of exile. This is why the transition phase feels so much like burnout. You're experiencing the grief of letting go of an identity and lifestyle that brought you success and respect, while simultaneously not yet having arrived in the new identity and lifestyle that will bring you meaning and purpose. You're in the gap, and gaps are terrifying, especially in a culture that values certainty and productivity and visible progress. The exhaustion comes from holding this tension, from resisting the urge to retreat back to what's familiar, from trusting that the discomfort is leading somewhere valuable even though you can't see the destination yet. Maslow found that people who could reframe this exhaustion as evidence of courage rather than weakness, as proof they were doing the hard work of becoming rather than the easy work of maintaining, were able to persist through this phase with much less suffering. Another dimension of this transition that Maslow documented extensively is the experience of loneliness. When you begin moving towards self-actualization, you often outgrow your existing peer group and haven't yet found your new community. The people who knew and loved the achieving version of you might not understand or support the searching version of you. They might interpret your questions and changes as rejection of them, as judgment of their choices, as evidence you've become arrogant or lost. You might find yourself increasingly unable to engage in conversations about status and achievement and acquisition that used to feel normal, while also not yet having found the people who speak the language of purpose and meaning and authenticity that you're learning. This social isolation is one of the most painful aspects of the transition, and Maslow noted that many people abandon their growth journey, not because they can't handle the internal work, but because they can't handle the loneliness that comes with outgrowing their tribe before finding a new one. Yet Maslow also found that this loneliness, as difficult as it is, serves a crucial function. It creates space for you to hear your own voice, to discover what you actually think and feel and want, without the constant input and influence of others. In some ways, the loneliness is the price of individuation, the cost of becoming a self-directed person rather than a socially directed one. The people Maslow studied who successfully navigated this phase often described a period of what felt like social exile, where they withdrew from their usual networks and spent significant time alone, not in depression, but in deep reflection, processing, and experimentation with their emerging identity. Eventually, as they became more solid in their authentic self, they began to attract new relationships that were aligned with who they were becoming rather than who they had been. Relationships based on genuine resonance rather than shared performance of social expectations. Maslow's research also highlighted the role of what he called the Jonah complex, the fear of one's own greatness. the tendency to run from the full realization of one's potential because it feels too big, too threatening, too demanding. Many people in this transition phase experience not just exhaustion, but actual fear of what they might become if they fully committed to their authentic path. There's a voice that whispers, "It's safer to stay small, safer to play the roles others expect, safer to settle for success rather than risk the unknown territory of significance." This fear manifests as procrastination, self-sabotage, perfectionism, staying busy with tasks that don't actually move you forward, anything to avoid the confrontation with your own potential. Maslow found that naming this fear, recognizing it as a natural part of growth rather than evidence of inadequacy, helps people move through it rather than being controlled by it. The forgotten stage that Maslow identified, this transition between esteem and self-actualization, matters so much because it's where most people give up on their potential. They interpret the exhaustion as burnout, the confusion as depression, the loneliness as evidence they made a mistake, and they retreat back to the familiar territory of achievement and external validation. Or they push through with force and determination, trying to willpower their way to enlightenment. And they actually do burn out because they're fighting the natural rhythm of growth. What Maslow offered was a third way, understanding that this phase is supposed to be difficult, that the discomfort is not pathology but transition, that the exhaustion is not weakness but the energy cost of transformation, and that the way through is not back and not force but trust, patience, awareness, and support. The implications of Maslow's work on this transition are profound for how we understand burnout in modern culture. Much of what we label as burnout is actually growth anxiety, the discomfort of people trying to evolve beyond achievement-focused identity into purpose-driven living, but not having a framework to understand what's happening to them. We treat it as a medical problem to be fixed with rest and boundaries and self-care, when what's actually needed is a developmental framework that normalizes the pain of outgrowing who you've been and becoming who you're meant to be. This doesn't mean burnout isn't real, or that rest and boundaries aren't important. It means we need to distinguish between burnout from overwork, which requires rest and recovery, and growth exhaustion from identity transition, which requires awareness, patience, and support for transformation. Richard, Eleanor, Thomas, and the dozens of other individuals Maslow studied over his career all shared a common thread. They reached a point where conventional success stopped satisfying them, where they felt simultaneously driven and depleted, where they questioned whether they were burning out or waking up. The ones who made it through to self-actualization weren't the ones who had fewer obstacles or easier circumstances. They were the ones who had the framework to understand what was happening to them, who could recognize growth anxiety as different from pathology, who found at least one person who could support them through the confusion and loneliness, and who developed the patience to let the transformation unfold at its own pace, rather than forcing or abandoning it. Richard, Eleanor, Thomas, and the dozens of other individuals Maslow studied over his career all shared a common thread. They reached a point where conventional success stopped satisfying them, where they felt simultaneously driven and depleted, where they questioned whether they were burning out or waking up. The ones who made it through to self-actualization weren't the ones who had fewer obstacles or easier circumstances. They were the ones who had the framework to understand what was happening to them, who could recognize growth anxiety as different from pathology, who found at least one person who could support them through the confusion and loneliness, and who developed the patience to let the transformation unfold at its own pace, rather than forcing or abandoning it. So when you wake up at 3 a.m. exhausted by your own growth, drained by the process of becoming, confused about whether you're on the right path or making a terrible mistake, remember Richard wondering if success was supposed to feel this empty. Remember Eleanor making partner and feeling nothing but depletion. Remember Thomas learning that regression is part of the journey forward. What you're experiencing is not burnout from doing too much, but transformation from becoming something new. And the exhaustion is not weakness, but evidence that you're doing the hardest work there is, outgrowing who you've been conditioned to be, and stepping into who you actually are. This is the forgotten stage Maslow discovered, the one nobody talks about because it's messy and uncomfortable and doesn't fit into motivational quotes. But it's real, it's necessary, And understanding it might be exactly what keeps you going when every instinct tells you to turn back. You made it through this exploration. And if you're still here, if something in these stories resonated with that exhausted, courageously searching part of you, then you already know you're not alone in this valley of transition. You've been brave enough to feel the discomfort, to ask the hard questions, to sit with the confusion between achievement and meaning. That takes courage most people never access, because they stay in the comfortable prison of external validation their whole lives. If you want to continue discovering these deeper patterns of growth, if you're ready to keep exploring this journey from success to significance with others who understand what you're going through, then join this community we're building together. Click the button to continue discovering, and you'll be part of a space where we release insights twice a week for people willing to ask hard questions about purpose and authenticity, even when the path doesn't look like traditional success. Next time we're exploring what Maslow discovered about peak experiences, those moments of profound meaning that become more frequent as you move toward self-actualization, and why some people access them regularly while others go their entire lives without experiencing them once. It's grounded in actual research, no nonsense, just honest exploration of the spiritual dimension of growth. Thank you for being here, for doing this hard work even when it feels like burnout, for trusting that the exhaustion means something more. You're exactly where you need to be, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. Keep going. The valley has an end, and what's on the other side is worth every difficult step you're taking right now.